What if I told you that some of the thoughts you heard today were never really yours? Think about it. From the moment you woke up this morning, a voice has been speaking inside your head. A voice that comments on everything, judges, compares, predicts, remembers, worries, and plans. After listening to that voice for years, you probably stopped questioning it. You simply assumed that voice is you. But what if it isn't? What if the voice you've trusted your entire life is only an echo of your parents, your teachers, your culture, your fears, and your past experiences? Most people never ask this question, and because they never ask it, they spend their entire lives obeying thoughts they never consciously chose. They inherit beliefs, inherit fears, inherit opinions, and eventually call those things me. But are they really you? Or are they simply old stories repeated so many times that they now feel true? Take a moment and look closely at your own mind. Who taught you what success means? Who taught you what failure means? Who taught you what is possible for your life? Who taught you what you should fear? And perhaps the most important question of all, who is the one listening to all of those thoughts right now? Because the answer to that question may change everything. It may change the way you see your past, the way you see your future, and the way you see yourself. And it may reveal something that has been hidden in plain sight your entire life. The difference between the voice in your head and the awareness that hears it. Welcome to Until Awakening. Today we're going to explore a question that may completely change the way you see your thoughts, your identity, and yourself. If you enjoy exploring ideas about awareness, consciousness, and personal transformation, consider subscribing and joining our growing community. Now take a slow breath, because every awakening begins with a moment of awareness, a moment just like this one. Most people believe they are thinking their own thoughts. But what if that isn't entirely true? Think about the way you see the world today. The things you believe, the things you fear, the things you hope for, and even the way you talk to yourself. How much of that was consciously chosen by you? When you were born, you didn't arrive with opinions about success. You didn't arrive with beliefs about money, relationships, failure, confidence, or self-worth. You didn't arrive believing that you were good enough or not good enough. You learned those things, slowly, quietly, and often without realizing it. Ideas were planted in your mind. Some came from your family, some came from school, some came from friends, religion, culture, social media, and the society around you. Year after year, those ideas were repeated until they became familiar. And what becomes familiar often begins to feel true. Imagine hearing the same message thousands of times throughout your life. At first, it is just a suggestion. Then it becomes a belief. Eventually, it becomes part of your identity. A child hears that mistakes are dangerous and grows into an adult who fears taking risks. Another child hears constant criticism and grows into an adult who believes nothing they do is ever enough. Someone else grows up surrounded by fear and uncertainty, and later wonders why anxiety follows them everywhere. The fascinating part is that most of these beliefs are never questioned. They operate quietly in the background, influencing decisions, emotions, relationships, and even the future people create for themselves. This is why two people can experience the same situation and see completely different realities. One person sees opportunity, while another sees danger. One sees possibility, while another sees limitation. The event is the same, but the programming behind the interpretation is different. For most of their lives, people mistake this programming for who they are. They say, "This is just the way I am." But is it? Or is it simply a collection of ideas, experiences, and beliefs that have been repeated for so long that they now feel permanent? The moment you begin asking that question, something important happens. You create distance between yourself and the program. You stop assuming every thought is the truth. You stop assuming every fear is a warning. You stop assuming every inner voice deserves to be obeyed. And perhaps for the first time, you begin to realize that there is a difference between the thoughts appearing in your mind and the awareness observing those thoughts. That realization is where freedom begins. Maybe you've experienced this before. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, the room is dark, the world is quiet, and everyone seems to be asleep except your mind. You suddenly wake up, and for a few brief seconds, everything feels peaceful. There are no problems, no worries, no urgency, just silence. Then a thought appears. What if things don't work out? A few seconds later, another thought arrives. What if I made the wrong decision? What if I'm running out of time? What if things never get better? Before you even realize what's happening, your mind has started building an entire story. The future becomes a problem, the past becomes evidence, and every uncertainty suddenly feels like a threat. The strange thing is that nothing has actually happened. The room is exactly the same. The future hasn't arrived. The danger isn't in front of you. And yet, your heart begins to beat faster, your chest feels tighter, and your body starts reacting as if a real emergency is taking place. Why? Because the mind is incredibly powerful. It can create a reality so convincing that the body responds as though imagination were fact. One thought creates an emotion, that emotion strengthens the thought, and together they begin feeding each other. A simple concern becomes anxiety. Anxiety becomes fear. Fear becomes a story. And before long, you've created an entire world inside your head. Maybe you're replaying a conversation that happened years ago. Maybe you're imagining an argument that hasn't happened yet. Maybe you're worrying about a future that exists only in imagination. Yet, while it's happening, it feels completely real. This is one of the greatest tricks of the thinking mind. It never announces itself by saying, "I am about to create a fictional story." Instead, it presents the story as reality. It presents possibility as certainty. It presents fear as truth. Most people never notice this process. They become completely absorbed by the story, completely identified with the fear, completely convinced that every thought deserves attention. But every once in a while, something remarkable happens. A moment of awareness appears. In the middle of all the noise, you suddenly notice what is happening. You realize that your mind is telling a story. You realize that fear is creating a future that does not yet exist. You realize that the voice in your head is speaking, and for the first time, you are listening to it instead of becoming it. That single realization changes everything. The thoughts may still be there. The emotions may still be there. The uncertainty may still be there. But now, something else is present as well. Awareness. For the first time, there is the story, and there is the one observing the story. There is the fear, and there is the awareness noticing the fear. There is the voice, and there is the presence listening to the voice. That is the moment the spell begins to break. Because the mind wants complete identification. It wants you to become the fear, become the worry, become the prediction, become the story. But awareness creates space, and inside that space, freedom begins. The room is still dark, the future is still unknown, life is still unfolding exactly as before. Yet, something fundamental has changed. You are no longer completely trapped inside the story. And perhaps that is the first glimpse of awakening. Not the absence of thought, but the presence of awareness. The moment you notice that your mind is telling a story, a fascinating question begins to emerge. Who is noticing it? Think about that for a moment. If you can observe a thought, then there must be something in you that is separate from the thought itself. If you can watch fear arise, then there must be something in you that is not the fear. If you can hear the voice inside your head, then who is the one listening? Most people spend their entire lives focused on the content of their thoughts. They pay attention to what the mind is saying, what it is worrying about, what it is planning, what it is remembering. Very few people ever stop to investigate the one who is aware of all of it. Imagine sitting beside a river. The water keeps moving. New waves appear every second. Some are calm, some are turbulent. Some move slowly, others rush past. Thoughts are very much the same. They are constantly moving through the mind. One thought is replaced by another, and then another, and then another. But the interesting question is this: are you the river, or are you the one sitting beside it? For most of their lives, people assume they are the river. They become identified with every thought, every emotion, every opinion, and every reaction. If a fearful thought appears, they become afraid. If an angry thought appears, they become angry. If a self-critical thought appears, they immediately believe it. But the moment awareness enters the picture, something changes. You begin to see that thoughts are events occurring within consciousness. They appear, they stay for a while, then they disappear. The same is true for emotions. The same is true for mental images. The same is true for memories. Everything comes and goes. Yet something remains. There is something within you that has been present through every experience of your life. It was there during childhood. It was there during your teenage years. It was there during moments of success and moments of failure. It was there through every relationship, every challenge, every victory, and every loss. Thoughts changed. Beliefs changed, your body changed, your circumstances changed, yet the simple fact of being aware remained. Eckhart Tolle often refers to this as the deeper dimension of who you are, not the historical self that is built from memories, labels, and conditioning, but the deeper awareness that exists beneath all of those things. Most people are so absorbed in their thinking that they overlook this entirely. Their attention is consumed by the next problem, the next task, the next worry, the next goal. The voice in the mind becomes so loud that they never notice the silent presence behind it. And yet that presence is always there. Even right now, as you listen to these words, there is an awareness hearing them. There is an awareness noticing the meaning of each sentence. There is an awareness observing your reactions, your agreements, your doubts, and your thoughts. That awareness does not need to be created. It does not need to be earned. It does not need to be improved. It only needs to be recognized. And perhaps this is the beginning of a completely different way of living. A life in which you no longer believe every thought. A life in which you no longer obey every fear. A life in which you discover that there is something infinitely deeper than the voice in your head. The observer, the witness, the awareness that has been quietly present through your entire life, waiting to be noticed. Once you begin discovering the observer behind your thoughts, another question naturally appears. If so many of my thoughts are not really me, then where did they come from in the first place? The answer is both simple and surprising. Most of the thoughts, beliefs, fears, assumptions, and emotional patterns that shape a person's life were not consciously chosen. They were learned. Imagine a newborn child entering the world. That child does not arrive with beliefs about success, failure, money, relationships, politics, religion, confidence, or self-worth. The child arrives with awareness, curiosity, and the ability to learn. Everything else is gradually added over time. Year after year, the child observes the world around them. They listen to the conversations happening at home. They watch how their parents react to stress. They absorb the fears, expectations, habits, and beliefs of the people closest to them. They learn what is considered acceptable, what is considered dangerous, what is considered valuable, and what is considered impossible. Most of this learning happens automatically. The child is not sitting down and consciously evaluating every belief. They are simply absorbing information. In many ways, the mind functions like a sponge, taking in ideas from family, school, culture, religion, friends, television, social media, and every other environment it encounters. Over time, these repeated messages become familiar. Familiar ideas become assumptions, assumptions become beliefs, and beliefs eventually become part of identity. What began as something heard from the outside slowly starts sounding like an inner voice. A child who repeatedly hears that the world is dangerous may grow into an adult who constantly expects problems. A child who is frequently criticized may grow into an adult who becomes their own harshest critic. A child who learns that love must be earned may spend years trying to prove their worth to other people without ever understanding why. The fascinating thing is that most people never notice this process. They simply assume that the voice in their head has always belonged to them. They assume that their fears are facts, their limitations are reality, and their beliefs are objective truth. Yet, when you begin looking closely, you often discover that many of these mental patterns originated long before you were capable of questioning them. Carl Jung once observed that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. There is enormous wisdom in that statement, because what many people call personality is often a collection of unconscious programs running beneath awareness. The person believes they are freely choosing, while in reality, they are often reacting according to patterns established years or even decades earlier. This does not mean that parents are to blame, that society is the enemy, or that your past has permanently damaged you. Every human being inherits conditioning. Every human being receives programming from the environment in which they grow up. The important question is not whether you were conditioned. The important question is whether you are aware of the conditioning now. Because the moment you become aware of a program, you stop being completely controlled by it. The moment you notice a belief, you gain the ability to question it. The moment you recognize a pattern, you create space between yourself and the pattern. And in that space, something remarkable begins to happen. You realize that a learned belief is not necessarily the truth. A repeated thought is not necessarily reality. An emotional reaction is not necessarily an accurate reflection of the present moment. They may simply be echoes of the past, continuing to replay themselves in the present. This is why awareness is so powerful. Awareness does not fight the program. Awareness illuminates the program. It allows you to see what was previously hidden, and once something is clearly seen, it becomes much more difficult for it to unconsciously control your life. Perhaps that is the real beginning of freedom. Not becoming someone new, but finally seeing what has been shaping the person you thought you were. Imagine a child standing in front of a mirror. The child is 5 years old, full of curiosity, full of energy, and completely unaware of concepts like success, failure, status, comparison, or self-worth. The child looks at their reflection without judging it. There is no voice saying, "I am not attractive enough." There is no voice saying, "I am falling behind." There is no voice saying, "I need to become someone else before I can be happy." Those voices have not arrived yet. But life begins teaching, not through formal lessons, but through repetition, observation, and emotional experiences. The child watches how adults speak about themselves. They listen to conversations about money, relationships, success, failure, fear, and security. They observe how people react when things go wrong, and how they behave when life becomes difficult. Little by little, invisible messages begin to accumulate. Perhaps the child hears a parent constantly worrying about money. Years later, they find themselves feeling anxious whenever financial uncertainty appears. Perhaps the child hears criticism more often than encouragement. Years later, they discover an inner voice that is never satisfied, no matter how much they achieve. Perhaps they grow up in an environment where emotions are suppressed, and later, they struggle to understand why genuine connection feels so difficult. The remarkable thing is that these patterns often feel personal. The person assumes, "This is just who I am." Yet, when they look more closely, they begin to realize that many of these thoughts were learned long before they had the ability to question them. Imagine carrying a recording device with you for 20 years. Every day, it quietly plays the same messages. At first, you hear the recording. Eventually, you stop noticing it. Not because it disappeared, but because it became familiar. The voice becomes part of the background. It becomes so normal that you mistake it for your own. This is how conditioning often works. A repeated message slowly transforms into a belief, and a belief repeated often enough begins to feel like reality. Over time, the original source is forgotten. The teacher disappears. The parent disappears. The childhood environment disappears. Yet, the voice remains. Now it speaks from within. It says, "You are not ready." It says, "You are not good enough." It says, "People like you don't succeed." It says, "Something will probably go wrong." And because the voice sounds familiar, it sounds true. This is why awareness is such a powerful force. Awareness allows you to hear the recording again. For the first time, you stop listening automatically and begin listening consciously. You begin asking questions. Where did this belief come from? Who taught me this? Is it actually true? Or have I simply repeated it for so long that it feels true? Many people spend decades trying to change their lives without ever questioning the voice that is directing those lives. They try to change their circumstances while remaining loyal to the same unconscious patterns. They try to create a new future while continuing to obey an old program. But the moment you see the program, something extraordinary happens. You realize that a learned belief can be questioned. A conditioned response can be transformed. A voice that was inherited does not have to become your destiny. And perhaps for the first time, you begin to hear something deeper than the conditioning. Not another belief, not another opinion, not another story, but the quiet awareness that has been present underneath all of it, patiently waiting for you to notice that you were never the voice in the first place. By now, you may be beginning to see that many of the thoughts running through your mind were learned, inherited, and reinforced over years of repetition. But there is another layer to this story, a layer that most people never notice because it hides behind something that appears completely normal. Thinking. Not useful thinking, not creative thinking, not the kind of thinking that helps you solve a problem or make an important decision, but the endless stream of unconscious mental activity that continues from the moment you wake up until the moment you fall asleep. Most people assume this is simply part of being human. They assume that constantly thinking, constantly analyzing, constantly worrying, constantly replaying the past and rehearsing the future is normal. In a sense, it is normal, but normal does not necessarily mean healthy. Imagine carrying a radio that never turns off. At first, you might find it interesting. You might even enjoy the noise. But after years of listening to it every waking hour, you would begin to forget what silence sounds like. Eventually, the noise would become so familiar that you would mistake it for reality itself. This is exactly what happens to millions of people every day. They become so accustomed to the constant activity of the mind that they never stop to question it. The mind comments on everything, judges everything, compares everything, predicts problems, revisits old memories, creates imaginary conversations, worries about situations that have not happened, and continuously searches for something else to think about. Because this process is happening all the time, it becomes invisible. What makes this even more fascinating is that the mind often creates the very problems it later tries to solve. A thought produces anxiety. Anxiety creates more thoughts. Those thoughts create more anxiety, and the cycle begins feeding itself. Before long, a person is no longer responding to reality. They are responding to a mental simulation of reality. This is why someone can lie awake at 3 in the morning, suffering from events that have never happened. This is why a person can spend an entire afternoon replaying a conversation from years ago. This is why people often experience fear long before there is anything to fear. The body responds as though the imagined event is real, even when the threat exists only inside the mind. Modern life amplifies this process. Every notification competes for attention. Every headline demands a reaction. Every social media feed offers another reason to compare, judge, worry, or desire. The mind rarely receives an opportunity to rest, because there is always another distraction waiting, another opinion to consume, another problem to think about. What many people call boredom is often just the first few moments of being alone with themselves. The moment external stimulation disappears, the mind immediately rushes in to fill the empty space. It begins talking, analyzing, remembering, planning, and worrying, because the ego has become deeply uncomfortable with stillness. This is one of the reasons silence feels strange to so many people. It is also one of the reasons why genuine presence feels unfamiliar. When the noise begins to fade, something unexpected happens. The mind no longer occupies the entire field of awareness. For the first time, there is space. And that space can feel unsettling at first, because the ego survives through activity. It survives through stories, labels, opinions, problems, conflicts, and identities. Without those things, it begins to lose the sense of control it has spent years maintaining. Eckhart Tolle often points out that many people are not actually addicted to substances, situations, or external experiences as much as they are addicted to the continuous movement of thought itself. The mind is constantly seeking the next thing to think about because it has forgotten how to simply be. The remarkable thing is that most people never realize this is happening. They spend decades living inside a stream of thought without ever stepping back to observe the stream itself. They assume the voice is who they are, the stories are reality, and the mental noise is an unavoidable part of existence. Yet, the moment you become aware of this process, something begins to change. You start noticing the machinery behind the experience. You begin to see how thought creates emotion, how emotion strengthens thought, and how both combine to create a self-perpetuating cycle. More importantly, you begin to realize that awareness exists prior to the cycle. And once you discover that awareness, even for a few brief moments, the addiction begins to weaken. Because for the first time, you are no longer completely identified with the thinking mind. You are observing it, and in that observation, a completely different possibility starts to emerge. Imagine, just for a moment, that the voice in your head suddenly becomes quiet. Not forever, not because you forced it to stop, not because you won a battle against your mind, but simply because for a brief moment, your attention is no longer completely absorbed by thought. For most people, this moment arrives unexpectedly. It may happen while watching a sunset, standing beside the ocean, walking alone through nature, listening to music, or simply sitting in silence after a long and exhausting day. Nothing extraordinary happens on the outside, yet something extraordinary happens within. The constant commentary begins to fade. The endless analysis slows down. The stream of judgments loses momentum. And for the first time in what feels like years, there is space. Many people spend their entire lives searching for peace without realizing that peace was never missing. It was simply hidden behind layers of mental noise. Like the sky hidden behind clouds, awareness remains present even when it cannot be seen clearly. In that moment of stillness, you begin to notice something remarkable. Life is still here. The room is still here. Your body is still breathing. The world continues exactly as before. Yet the experience feels completely different because the mind is no longer standing between you and reality. Colors seem more vivid. Sounds feel clearer. Ordinary moments suddenly feel alive. Not because the world has changed, but because your relationship to it has changed. For a brief moment, you are no longer trapped inside a story about life. You are simply experiencing life directly. This is why so many spiritual traditions speak about presence. Not because presence is a special state reserved for a few enlightened people, but because presence is what remains when attention returns to this moment, instead of being lost in memories of the past or fantasies about the future. The ego often fears this experience because it cannot survive without constant identification. It needs problems to solve, stories to defend, opinions to maintain, and identities to protect. Silence feels threatening because silence reveals something deeper than the ego. Yet once you experience this deeper dimension, even briefly, something changes forever. You realize that peace is not something you must create. It is something you uncover. You realize that awareness is not a distant goal. It is the very foundation of your experience right now. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to understand that the freedom you have been searching for has never been somewhere else. It has never been waiting in a future achievement, a future relationship, or a future version of yourself. It has been quietly present beneath the noise all along, patiently waiting for you to notice it. The day the noise stopped, was not the day life became perfect. It was the day you finally discovered that you are more than the noise. So where does this leave us? Perhaps with a question. Not a question for your mind to answer immediately, but a question to carry with you after this video ends. If you are not every thought that appears in your mind, then who are you? If you are not the endless stream of stories about your past, then who are you? If you are not the fears, the labels, the conditioning, the opinions, and the identities you inherited throughout your life, then what remains? Maybe the purpose of awakening is not to become someone new. Maybe it is not about adding more knowledge, more techniques, more beliefs, or more information. Maybe awakening is a process of remembering the awareness that was present before the conditioning arrived. Remembering the silence that exists beneath the noise. Remembering that life is happening here, now, in this moment, and not only in the stories the mind keeps telling about it. You do not have to fight your thoughts. You do not have to force your mind into silence. You do not have to become perfect before you deserve peace. All you have to do is begin noticing. Notice the thoughts. Notice the emotions. Notice the stories. Notice the voice. And then notice the awareness that is noticing all of them. Because every moment of awareness weakens unconsciousness. Every moment of presence weakens identification. And every moment of genuine observation brings you closer to the deeper dimension of who you truly are. Perhaps that is why you found this video. Perhaps something within you already knew that there was more to life than the endless noise of the thinking mind. And perhaps this journey is only beginning. Thank you for spending these moments with us here at Until Awakening. If this message resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who may need to hear it today. And let us know in the comments what insight stayed with you the most. We read your comments, we appreciate your support, and most importantly, we appreciate your presence. As always, at the end of this video, I wish you health, peace, prosperity, and awareness. Take good care of yourself. May wisdom guide your path. Until next time.